We start with the Republican agenda at the state legislature. These bills passed their first committee hurdle last week. A ban on books that depict any kind of sex or what the bill calls, quote, acts of homosexuality, which sounds like just being gay. Also, permission for educators to out LGBT students to their parents. Still waiting for a hearing, a bill that would end early voting, require immediate hand counts of ballots after elections, and let lawmakers reject the results of an election. Joining us for a reality check on this legislation are Chad Campbell, former Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, now a senior vice president at the consulting firm Strategies 360. And Paul Bentz, Senior Vice President for Research and Polling Guru at HighGround Consulting. Welcome back to Square Off.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Paul, you kind of have your finger on the pulse. So what are these bills telling us, not just about Republicans in the legislature, but Republican voters?
Well, Republican voters are very much poised and focused on 2022. This year should be a very good year for Republicans, and these legislators are trying to target those individuals and get them ready to go and use issues like education, use issues like parent choice to try to drive their base while appealing to independent and unaffiliated voters who tend to lean their direction on that issue.
And Chad, conservatives have been bringing their bills to the Capitol for years, social conservatives. How does this session rate, on a culture war scale from just a skirmish to DEFCON 1?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely unlike anything we've seen, at least in my history, in the past 20 years of working politics here in Arizona. You mentioned all these bills. It's just a full-scale assault on social issues, on education, on election integrity. It's something that we've never seen before, and I think it's only going to get worse as we get closer to the election cycle, as Paul was talking about, and especially the primary. I mean, as Paul mentioned, these are really aimed at Republican primary voters. That's what this is trying to court. It'll be interesting to see how this pivots to the general election.
That's a really good question, because we're seeing that in the statewide races as well. Candidates going really far to the right. And so, Paul, the question is this year, whether you're statewide or a local legislator, can you pivot back to the center or maybe even less to the right when you have these bills on your resume?
Well, certainly a number of them are red meat bills. We'll see if they actually go as far as we think they're going to go. That's the question, I think, on some of this stuff. But what ultimately what they're trying to do is, with redistricting that just took place, there's only about 4 swing districts. Otherwise, it's a pretty secure Republican dominance in the legislature. And so those folks that are in these safe districts aren't concerned about that. They're just concerned about playing to their base and the feedback that they're receiving. With Trump out of office, there's a lot of discontent, and they're trying to find ways to effectively harness that. We saw that in Virginia with parent choice, and I think they're trying to translate that here to Arizona.
And so I have to pause in a second and ask, is there a real problem here? I can't speak to it. My kids are been out of schools for a long time now. Paul, I'll ask you, is there a real problem here that any of this legislation addresses?
No, there's not. And in fact, if you talk to schools, critical race theory is not being taught in our schools. A lot of these things that are these threats are coming from the national cable news, and they're not accurate of what's going on in our actual schools. And schools are under attack. But the problem is only about 30% of our electorate have kids at home. The other 70% do not have direct interaction with schools on a regular basis, don't know what's being taught. And so they believe what's being said on this cable news as gospel. They just believe it wholeheartedly. And that's what's creating these challenges, particularly in rural school districts, as well as school districts in the suburbs and heavy Republican areas. They're struggling to curate what they're actually doing because it's so difficult to come back and counteract all of this rumors and the stuff that's being spread.
That's a really important point, just who they're aiming at, an electorate that does not have kids in school. So let's get a reality check that elections bill that would just overhaul our elections and give lawmakers now in the Republican-controlled legislature the power to throw out your vote in 2022. A reality check. Does that have any hope of passing the legislature and being sent to Governor Doug Ducey? Do any of these other bills we've been talking about have any hope of passing? Paul Bentz, what could stand in the way?
Well, I think we will see some election reforms. There are, remember 70% of Republicans think that there was significant fraud that impacted the outcome of the election. So they will do some of these things. Some of the more extreme issues like banning early voting will not go anywhere. It's wildly unpopular. A majority of our electorate uses early voting. They're not going to ban early voting. I think some of the reforms in place to make it easier to count, make it more secure, requiring additional identification, those are likely to pass in the making it more secure, and why wouldn't we want to keep our elections safe? Some of this, though, comes down to is these are just Republicans finding ways to get Democrats to overreact. I mean, they keep pushing things out there to try to get that overreaction because they know that they can get a rise out of their opponents. This is not necessarily even about reform, but rather scoring points against your opponents on issues like elections, on issues like education and others.
And so we haven't talked about, and the legislature still hasn't talked about, probably the most important thing there on their agenda, the fiscal cliff that schools face by March 1st, unless the legislature does something to raise the school spending limit. Schools could face massive budget cuts that could result in layoffs and maybe even school closings by April 1st. We haven't heard anything about that from the governor or from Republicans in the legislature. Paul, Chad, I'll start with you, Paul. Do you have any idea of what's going on behind the scenes to beat that deadline?
Well, there's a lot of discussions going on behind the scenes on how to solve it. And to be clear, it's a $1.2 billion cut, about 17% of the school's budgets. And it's not because the schools have done anything wrong. And in fact, this is state money that's supposed to be given to the schools. Just the schools won't be able to legally spend it without an exemption of the limit. So there's a lot of discussions going on of what could be traded for this. I think there will be solutions, but there's a lawsuit standing in the way, the Prop 208 lawsuit, which is the increase in the income tax. They're trying to wait for that to be settled and see what the guidance is from the court before they move forward. But I do think there is a deal to be had here. It's going to come down to the wire.
They only have 16 working days left or so. Chad, can they get this done?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, too, I mean, their attempts to banning books right now will be solved because probably schools won't be able to afford any books at all if they don't actually fix this spending limit that's going to pop in here in April. So that takes care of itself. This is a critical issue. But I think to Paul's point about the lawsuit and Prop 208 and that ballot measure that was just approved by voters last election cycle, this is a political game being played. The Republicans are trying to buy time for that lawsuit to be settled to undermine the voters' the voters' support of increased funding for education. I don't know if the deal's going to be cut or not. I think this is a big political game being played. It's a game of chicken, but ultimately, the voters are going to speak again, one way or another. And I think that the Republicans will be held accountable if they don't fix this spending limit soon.
All right, got to end it there. Chad Campbell and Paul Bentz, thanks so much for joining us.